Muy gran honor tenerlos todos aquí, especialmente Enrique Peñalosa. I'm so glad that we're all here. Let's switch to English. Very welcome to FORES, the Forum for Reforms, Entrepreneurship and Sustainability. I know a lot of you have been here many times before. I know some of you have not been here before. I'm glad that we are finally relevant for you, for those who haven't been here before. At FORES, we work mainly with entrepreneurship, environmental issues, focusing on climate. And when we focus on climate, we focus a lot on transport, because we see that when Sweden needs to tackle climate issues, transport is paramount. And within our work at transport, we inaugurated the 2030 Secretariat last December 16. The same morning, the Swedish government, the government at the time, said that they wanted to reach a fossil-independent transport fleet by 2030. And then in the afternoon, we inaugurated a secretariat with a sort of coalition of the willing, with partners who want to do just that. And we got some of them around the table. We got Preem, for instance, Argan are coming, and others are going to join later. And I'm going to teach you some Swedish now. When we want to achieve a fossil-independent transport sector in Sweden, we aim to do that through changes within bilen, bränsle och beteendet. Bilen is the vehicle, bränslet is the fuel, och beteendet is the behavioral changes. And we see that when we look at behavioral changes, a lot hinges around how to improve public transport, how to make it more attractive to take the bike, how to also sometimes make it more attractive to perhaps not always transport yourself physically, but to work from home or elsewhere. But when we look at public transport and cycling, the one example that's been shining the brightest for the last 15 years or so has been the work that was done in Bogotá, late 1990s and early 21st century, with the Transmilenio and all the ciclovías and the Sundays that are car-free, and thousands of parks that have been set up for people to enjoy. So when, even myself, when I was working in Chile, the Transmilenio was always the shining example. And then when I was working in Nairobi years later, Transmilenio was again, that was always mentioned. So the founder of the Transmilenio project and the founder of all those cycling projects in Bogotá, which has now been spread all over the world, I'm so excited to have you here with us. We're first going to have an introduction by Enrique. Then we're going to have brief remarks from tågoperatörerna, from kollektivtrafiken, and from the cyclists whom I don't see around here, who will be here soon, I hope. And we're actually still 5 minutes early. We're not supposed to start yet, but that's just how excited we are to have you here. And then we'll have a roundtable where we can all share our opinions and get Enrique's opinions on what we propose to do. Enrique, the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Matthias, and thank you for this opportunity to share some ideas with you. I see mainly is a focus on transport and mobility. And of course, I will make a special emphasis in the developing world, where I think we're doing most things wrong. And you know, it's very sad, because I would say that about 90% of the urban environments or the cities that will be built in the developing world in 50 years from now have not yet been built. So in the next 50 years, we're going to build about 90% of the cities that will exist in the year 2070 or something like this. And we should be doing some things that are different and better. And unfortunately, we are not doing anything better, and generally we're doing things worse. I will say that I believe that our cities today are not just a little wrong, they are totally wrong. But we are so used to them that we think they are normal. And why are they wrong? Because I think they are wrong because people live in fear of getting killed. And I don't think it's normal that any animal in its habitat should be in fear of getting killed, should live in constant fear of being killed. But sometimes we have to use, I like to give this example, that sometimes when we look back, we see how it was very obvious that things should have changed. For example, when we look today at the French Revolution, it seems very obvious that the things that happened in the French Revolution should have happened. But it was not so obvious because 1,000 years had gone by and nothing had changed. But let's not go so far back. Women could not vote in Sweden 90 years ago. Or in England, or in France, or in the United States. Not in Colombia, in Sweden. And everybody thought this was totally normal. It was not fascists or Nazis who thought that women should not vote. Everybody thought this was totally normal, that women should not vote. And we are talking about very advanced societies. I mean, Beethoven had composed his music more than 200 years before the women could vote. You know, it's not like we were in the caves. And so, but sometimes we are so used to some things that are horribly wrong that we don't think there is anything bad with it. Right? So I think there is I like this interpretation, this Mr. Thomas Kuhn, that talk about the changes in paradigms. Science does not change in a linear way. I mean, it was not slowly that we began to find that the Earth was round, and so we first thought the Earth was flat, and then we began to learn that it was a little rounder, and we found, no. All of a sudden, we discovered it was totally wrong, our view of Earth. So, and this is what I think will happen. So this is as a background to what I think is we should be doing. And I will just give you a couple more statistics. And I think it's almost cliche to talk of the problems that cars cause, because it's almost. But unfortunately, it is really what changed human habitat. This is the main change in human habitat. In 1900, and so this is one, with all the respect, I mean, electric cars, of course, are better than non-electric cars, but they don't really change much in terms of what I am worried about, which is that people should live in a different way. But, for example, in 1900, there is a wonderful book in the United States by Peter Norton that's called Fighting Traffic. But the book especially a wonderful research of how things changed when cars appeared, but really with research. And so, for example, in 1900, nobody was killed in the United States by cars. They were only beginning to appear, a few. Only 20 years later, between 1920 and 1930, 200,000 people were killed by cars in the United States. 200,000. Only in 1925, more than 8,000 children were killed by cars in the United States. Now, so let's go now to the developing world and to my story or my worries. I think most transport issues are a matter really of equity and politics. This is why Sweden is so wonderfully suited to solve things, because it's one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. I mean, it's not by chance that the Nordic countries are the ones that use bicycles the most. Why do people use much more bicycles in the Netherlands or in Denmark than in Italy or Spain, when the weather is much better in Italy or in Spain? It's because some rich businessman in Italy or Spain feels he's too important to go on bicycle next to other people and to use public transport next to other people. Instead, in the Netherlands or in Sweden, there is a different kind of attitude towards society. And so this is why it's possible. And this is the biggest obstacle to solutions in mobility in the developing world. This is a matter of equity. It's not a matter of engineering or even money. It's a matter of equity. And the basic issue, well, there are some issues that has to do, as you were mentioning, with behavior. Upper income people in developing countries, if you talk to them, they are desperate for subways. They really are so much, the only thing they like more besides subways is highways. But after highways, the thing they love the most is subways. Not because they have the slightest intention of ever using them. It has not crossed their mind. But because they think they will put other people underground, especially lower income people, and so they think they will have less traffic in this way, you know? So again, and I'm not joking, if you have some Mexican friend, for example, I'm sure all of you have some Mexican friends, and most of your Mexican friends will most likely, except if they are some really radical environmentalists, they will be most likely upper middle class Mexicans. Ask an upper middle class Mexican, not if he uses or she uses the subway. Ask them if they know it, the Mexico City subway, if they once in their life have been to it as tourists, just to get to know it. And I assure you, 99.9% of possibilities, they have never in their lives, not even once, they have been to the subway line. So again, so I'm trying to say is that, what am I trying to say is, for example, here I am invited to an environmental forum with you, and I'm very proud, I'm very happy, and I even got this wonderful Gothenburg Prize for Sustainable Development. But actually, I will confess to you that when I was doing all these things, I was really not concerned with the environment. I was concerned with equity and with quality of life. And what is funny is that the things are the same policies that you will apply for seeking equity are basically, in terms of transport, are basically the same that you will apply if you are a radical environmentalist. You know, of course I care about the environment. I'm not saying this, but this is not what. This was not really what my concern was when I tried. So, for example, I would say one of the main issues in our time is how to distribute that most valuable resources cities have, which is road space. Road space is more valuable. We could find oil or diamonds under any city, and it would not be so valuable as road space. The issue is how to distribute road space between pedestrians, bicyclists, public transport, and mixed traffic and cars. And there are no legal ways of doing it. I like to keep on reminding people, for example, that constitutions, especially in the developing world, have a lot of rights, pages and pages of rights. Not so many of obligations, but rights, lots of pages of rights. But even then, I don't know of any constitution that includes parking as a right. Parking is not a constitutional right anywhere. So this is maybe one of the maybe very obvious things, but most people don't assume so. If you try, and if you think this is easy, try to get rid of some parking in the street in any city. I mean, this is more difficult than to put a Colombian in a Colombian-made rocket in the moon. It's extremely difficult. It's the most difficult battle that you could give. People assume they have a right to parking. Most cities in the world give more space, not to cars, to parked cars, than to sidewalks, than to pedestrian space, than to space for people. Most cities in the planet. And people think this is totally normal. I mean, nobody has questioned. I mean, we have to remind people that, yes?
But in Sweden, we have some from the city of Stockholm is here, but we have a regulation or an institutional right regarding parking. If you build a new house, you're supposed to have an area that's marked and reserved for parking. So
Yes, most countries in the world require, by the way, when I talk about, by the way, this is an interesting question because actually many cities in the world are restricting parking now in buildings. However, I think cars are wonderful machines. I mean, cars are wonderful things to go to the countryside and to do many things. They're beautiful machines. They are fun. You go, look at the countryside, listen to music. I mean, they're wonderful. But, so I don't think we should restrict car ownership. Cars are wonderful. What we should restrict, what we are trying to do in the world is to restrict car use. Car use during mostly rush hours. And if we restrict parking at home, we are really restricting car ownership. So I don't think we should restrict car ownership. If people want to have cars, maybe somebody loves cars and they want to have 10 of them or 20, fine. It's like if they want to have 20 pianos, who cares, I mean, you know? as long as what we may want to restrict is how cars are used, especially during peak times, which is different. So if we're going to restrict parking, we should restrict parking in office buildings, in buildings which are destinations, shopping malls or shops, offices, not at houses, because when we restrict parking in homes, we are restricting ownership of cars. And I don't think we should restrict ownership of cars. If somebody wants to have 20 cars, why should we restrict them? It's the same. So, but this is, I don't want to go astray. And even though maybe this is we could start there very quickly. I was almost impeached when I was mayor because I got tens of thousands of cars which used to park in the streets. I would say the main difference in terms of infrastructure between advanced and backward cities is not highways or subways or trains, is quality sidewalks. This is what really makes a difference. You will find that I know many countries which have subways or even highways, but backward countries, they always have small. This is almost a picture of underdevelopment. To have bad sidewalks, to have small sidewalks, to have, in developing world, I would say, it's always cars are on sidewalks or where there should be sidewalks. And again, it was a huge battle because when I arrived to my city as mayor, maybe there was not even one street where you could go in a wheelchair from one corner to another. And so we had a war to get cars off the sidewalks, and of course, again, it's always the same battle. People will tell you, Mayor, you are so stubborn because there is enough space for people to park as well as for people to walk by. And so we had to have a TV commercial explaining, look, sidewalks are not for getting from one place to another. Sidewalks are not relatives of streets. We tend to think that sidewalks are relatives of streets because they live next to each other, but actually sidewalks are not for going from one place to another. Sidewalks are like for talking or for playing or for kissing. Sidewalks really are much closer relatives of parks or plazas. And to say that in a sidewalk there is enough space for people to walk by as well as to park cars next to them is almost equivalent to saying that we can turn the main park or the main plaza in a city into an open-air parking lot so long as we leave enough space between cars for people to walk by, So it is, anyways, it's a very difficult battle from the beginning. First, for people, to get some space for people, which is very difficult. I mean, this is a very difficult battle everywhere. Then, I will, when we talk about transport, before I go into quickly into buses or other things or bicycles, I like to emphasize that the most crucial, almost before we can talk about transport, we almost have to first know what kind of city we want. Because it's very different if what we want is a city like Houston than if what we want is a city like Amsterdam. So before we even propose any solution or we have to know what kind of city we want. But before we know what kind of city we want, we really have to know how do we want to live. Actually, because a city is only a means to a way of life. So when we begin to talk about transport, we end up not with transport engineering, but maybe with something that is closer to psychology or what is it that what kind of life will make us happier? And also, well, transport is very peculiar for many reasons in the developing world, for many reasons. But one of the things that makes it especially peculiar is that it's one problem that instead of getting better as we get richer, gets worse. For example, health or education or housing, we tend to be solved. I mean, we have better nutrition, better health as societies get richer. But traffic gets worse as societies get richer. Unless we change, is that really the paradigm of a non-sustainable model? But but clearly we are not going to go into why clearly making bigger roads will not solve traffic and all this. We all know that. We are all experts. But what is clear is that even before we go into buses or trains or whatever, we all agree that public transport is the solution. Here I don't think we should go into any other discussions. But for public transport to work, we need density. We need density. And so here we have another area in which Sweden is an example, because maybe you are not even conscious of this, but from 1904 in Sweden and Finland, most land around cities belongs to governments, to local governments, or to it's public land. In the developing world, land belongs to speculators, which forces people to very wrong places. So the most important thing for mobility to work is that cities grow in the right places and in the right way. This is more important than whether we discuss about bicycles or buses or trains or whatever, is that the cities grow in the right place and in the right way. And cities are growing at this time in the wrong places. For example, in every developing country, there is huge amounts of illegal developments. For example, in Colombia, my country, which is not the poorest, not the richest, not of the developing world, is not the most illegal, not the more legal, is like an average country. Like more than half of Colombian cities today started out illegally, grew up illegally. What does illegally means? That they were squatters, illegal developments of land, or else that the owners sold and urbanized the land where it was not allowed to be urbanized. So we have, for example, Bogotá is located in a very green plateau, very flat, very nice, 2,600 meters of altitude, and the city it is about 600,000 hectare plateau, and Bogotá only takes up about 35,000 hectares of this. However, a very large amount of the city grew in the mountains, very steep hills, sometimes even with the risk of sliding, where it's impossible to provide any good transport, where you can, it's almost, unless you are a super athlete, it's very difficult to go by bicycle. And also in some areas where there was flooding risk from the river. So why? Because what happens? Land, you know, I believe in the market. I believe in the market. I think most of the people in the planet today believe that private property and the market is the best way to manage most of society's resources, except some crazy nuts in North Korea or something. But most people in the world today believe that private property and the market are the best way to manage most things, to make shirts or tables or, I mean, in general. But in the case of land around cities that are growing, private property does not work. Why? Because the essence of the market is that when prices go up, if the price of tomatoes goes up or the price of these glasses goes up, then supply increases. People will grow more tomatoes and the prices will go back down. It's a very beautiful system. In the case of land around growing cities, if you increase the price of land, the supply of land that is accessible to water, to transportation, to schools, to jobs, does not increase. The well-located land. So the market does not work in the case of land. So the poor people are forced to wrong locations. And not only the illegal development. For example, I'll tell you an amazing story. Mexico had a fantastic financial system to finance low-income housing. You know, let's not go into this. And it had extremely efficient builders. I mean, they would build one house in every few hours. I mean, it was extremely efficient builders, but they did not control land. So now, this institute that Mexico has, the Infonavit, they are finding that the housing that they built over the last 25 years or 30 years, that 25% of these houses are empty. 22% are empty because they are too far from the cities. And these were legal housing. So all I'm trying to say, let's make this story short, is that the most important thing for mobility, and again, it's a result of inequality. Why is, you know, what happens? Land is private, and this is the land, the private land around cities. Some people become very, very rich because the land around the city becomes more and more expensive. And we don't have sophisticated taxing schemes, so we should be able to tax this value added to land. So anyway, so this is the first issue, density, and for this, land intervention. We did some land intervention. I believe we should do what Sweden did. I mean, we were 60 years too late. We have a horrible city with no parks, with no soccer fields, with nothing. I mean, for example, London has exact same population as Bogotá, 8 million people. London has more than 1,500 public soccer fields, football fields. Bogotá has 20. Every boy in Bogotá and more girls do play football. And London has 1,500 public soccer fields. Bogotá has 26. You know, it's why? Because land is private, so it's impossible. Government does not really have a good control of how cities grow or where they grow, so they grow in the wrong places, either too far from the city or in very high hills, without parks, without the infrastructure for transport, without anything. So let's go quickly to finish. I will go quickly, and I will also say something that is not very obvious. And is that buses are the only solution to mobility in the developing world. Trains are very cool, they are very cute, you know, everybody loves trains, nobody has to defend trains, you know. Who is going to be against trains? Everybody loves them. And we have some people who sell trains who are very good at selling trains in the developing world, you know, especially in buying public officials, because when you're building a $5 billion subway line, you know, 10% to distribute among some politicians goes a long way. And so some of the French and German subway salesmen are experts in this, more than in building trains, in paying bribes around. But of course, again, I love trains. Who would be against trains? They're perfect. But I will give you an example. I believe that, going back to constitutions, if all citizens are equal, the first article of all constitutions says all citizens are equal. I don't know the Swedish constitution, but I'm sure that's what it says in the first article. If all citizens are equal, clearly a bus with 100 passengers has a right to 100 times more road space than a car with one. This is obvious, but this is from the legal perspective. But from the technical perspective, it does not take a PhD from Uppsala. A committee of 12-year-old children in 20 minutes will find out that the most efficient way to use scarce road space is with exclusive lanes for buses. So, I believe that to have a bus in a traffic jam is almost as undemocratic as not having women vote, because clearly no bus should ever be on a traffic jam. Most developing countries have highways, urban highways, which are a disaster. All urban highways in the developing world, and even in advanced countries, maybe in Sweden is the only one that it doesn't happen, get jammed. All urban highways get jammed. And most urban highways in developing countries do not even have public transport in them. And I would like to ask you if there is one democratic or technical reason why there should not be exclusive lanes for buses on urban highways. The only possible reason to explain this is that these are very unequal societies, because it's a totally irrational way to use public space. Totally irrational. One bus lane can move up to the equivalent of people that 40 car lanes move. 40 car lanes. So I believe that if we were to give exclusive lanes to buses everywhere in cities, all cities, even these developing world cities which have a very poor road infrastructure, all cities have thousands of kilometers of lane roads. For example, Bogotá, even Bogotá, which has a very bad road infrastructure, has more than 15,000 kilometers of lane roads. So, clearly, if this was assigned in a rational way, giving exclusive lanes to buses, good sidewalks, bikeways, blah, 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 we would solve mobility in a matter of a few months. Of course, it takes a little more than that, but it is important to remember the following. What gives speed and capacity to systems, to transport systems, is not that the wheels are metal or rubber. What gives speed and capacity to systems is the exclusive corridor. Exclusive corridor. This is what gives. Of course, if you have a long distance, like 100 kilometers, of course, buses cannot go as fast as these super fast trains. These buses cannot do. But on any distance that is less than 25 kilometers or something like this, 30 kilometers, buses will basically do the same as trains do and many more things besides. So I'm not saying buses are better, but just I'm trying to say that buses are not inferior. We have an idea that buses, I don't have time at this time to explain this story, but basically in Bogotá, so what we did, and I think we did the Transmilenio bus system, copied from Curitiba, the way we did not invent it. Actually, Transmilenio spurred a whole revolution in the world in bus use, mainly because Curitiba, people thought it was a small, different city. But our Transmilenio bus system, at this time, even though it's very poorly managed, is moving more passengers our direction than all subways in Europe. There is not a subway line in Europe that moves as many passengers as our high capacity lines. And they could move much more if they were used in an intelligent way. I have some other ideas. Why should we put public transport users underground? Under the ground, to leave the beautiful views of the sky, natural sunlight, views of the city to car drivers? I don't think this is a very democratic way of doing it. Also, we could, I don't know how much time we could talk later, but I can give you some arguments why buses can be faster. For example, buses can change trunkways, can change lines without people having to get out. If you are in a subway, you have to get out, walk a couple of blocks, and wait for the next one. Buses can have stations that are closer to each other, so actually people have to walk less from the origin of the trip to the station and from the station to destination. Buses have, for example, if you're going to move 5,000 people an hour or 10,000, you will need 20 times more buses than trains, so you'll have higher frequencies, less waiting times. Very soon, buses will be electric, and very soon buses will be driverless. I mean, it's very simple. So actually, more and more buses and trains are going to be more and more similar. But especially, the point is cost. I will finish telling you an example. In Bogotá, we just had a study finished for a subway line, which people really want subways. You know, everybody wants a subway, of course, especially the upper-income people who will not use them. They really want a subway. The cost of this on paper, before we start making it, is $275 million per kilometer. $275 million per kilometer. And then we have a study for a BRT, another BRT line for Transmilenio at this time. Actually, when you do a BRT line like this we do, actually 60% of the cost is really for car lanes and for sidewalks. It's not really for the bus system itself. And the cost is $17 million per kilometer. So you do about 15 times more bus with the same money than you would do rail. Of course, again, I will insist, I love subways. I think they're the most marvelous machines. I have nothing against them. But the problem is that this is a political issue. I don't think if you would sit anybody if you are here in Sweden and you look into Bogotá and I ask you, what should you do with the same money? You know, this subway line will cost, according to, it's 27 kilometers. It will cost $7.5 billion, assuming we do not have any cost overruns, which would be marvelous for a subway. But this is $7.5 billion for 27 kilometers. For the same amount of money, we could do about 440 kilometers of BRT systems. 440. And now, at this time, we have like 112 kilometers of BRT, 112 at this time, and they move 2.3 million people every day with 112 kilometers. So there are very few subways in the planet, I would say maybe 5, which move 2.3 million passengers per day with 113 kilometers. Why do I discuss these issues? Not because I care about buses or because I care about trains, because this is political issues. The issue is, how do we distribute road space? I mean, it's so obvious that we should do BRT everywhere to use, you know. Why isn't it done? If it's so obvious, costs little, moves a lot of people, you know. It's very obvious. You would say this is very simple. Why? Because we do not have societies that are very democratic, because, of course, the car owners do not want to give up space to give to buses. Even though, for example, in Bogotá this time, only 22% of homes own cars. Only 22% of homes. So actually, this is another issue. I will tell you one story. If we were to ban car use tomorrow in Bogotá, I mean, only 19% of the population uses car every day to go to work. So if we were to ban cars tomorrow, 81% of the people would be better off, wouldn't they? Because clearly, if we ban cars tomorrow, 81% of the people will have less traffic, shorter travel times, less pollution. So why don't we ban car use tomorrow? A very, very large majority would be better off. If we have democracy, this is what democracy is about, no? But we are not even asking to ban cars. I mean, clearly, why aren't these things done? Because the 19% of the people who drive are the owners of the newspapers, are the owners of the television, are the owners of every business, are the higher income people, are the people who have all the power in society. The people who do not have cars, they have not even imagined that this is a possibility to ban cars. But if we had democracy, so we had a car-free day. We have a car-free day. When I was mayor, I proposed a referendum, almost a very European thing, that people should vote. First, we asked them if they wanted to totally ban car use during peak hours, beginning the year 2015. Beginning to ban car use during 2.5 peak hours in the morning and 2.5 peak hours in the afternoon. To ban totally car use. And the second question is if they wanted to ban totally car use one day a year, the first Thursday of every year, totally car use. So some business made a huge campaign against us, because they say, I mean, the world would end if people could not use cars and all this. So, but in the end, of course, you know, we needed, it was very crazy because we needed 33.3% of potential voters for this to be legally mandatory. This was and for so the people with cars, the big campaign who was made against us, they knew they were going to lose. They knew they were going to lose by far. By the way, to give you an idea, only about 38-39% of the people vote for Congress in Colombia. So to get 33.3% is huge, you know. Even for president, less than 50% of the people vote, you know. So they knew they were going to lose. So they made a big campaign, not for people to vote no, but for people not to vote, you know. So we missed the 33.3% threshold we got 33.2 something, you know. And then for the second question, whether we would have a car-free day once a year, we won. We got by far. So now we have a car-free day every year, the first Thursday of every February. And it's very interesting because a city that is 8 million inhabitants, we have one day a year, one Thursday, where, by the way, the city works as usual. Everybody goes to work, everybody goes to school, everybody saw. And what we can prove is that an 8 million inhabitant city can work without cars. I mean, we do have taxis. Taxis we have, but no private cars. So it's an interesting experiment. And again, to finish, just bicycles, mentioned bicycles. Bicycles, you know, the developing world, we don't have winter like in Sweden. You know, we have many cities in Colombia. You would not believe the amount of maybe cities which are only 100,000 people. They are not even too hot because some of them are relatively higher. So it's like in Sweden, you would just die if you would imagine this kind of weather. You know, it's perfect. You know, the day that you have 2 or 3 days a year like that, you know, that you go mad, they have every day of the year, this weather. Beautiful trees, vegetation, everything. So, and these are 100, and this, you will find thousands of cities in the developing world like this. 100,000 inhabitants, 50,000 inhabitants, 200,000 inhabitants, 300,000. Beautiful tropical trees, flowers, birds, butterflies. You know, it's almost like paradise. So what do they want to do? You would imagine they all want to go out on a bicycle, you know, and go to work, you know, and walk. No, they want to go on a SUV to an indoor shopping mall, you know. That's what they dream of doing, you know. So again, we are trying really, the discussion is how do we want to live? And it has a lot to do with equality. It's not a matter of, so bicycles, so when I was mayor, and this was interesting because now everybody's doing bicycle ways everywhere in the planet. But when I was mayor, this was almost 15, 16 years ago, Madrid or Paris or London or New York did not have 1 kilometer of bikeways. This did not exist at that time, 0. And we did almost 300 kilometers of bikeways. And again, it's equality. I would say in Bogotá, when you do a protected bikeway, this is important because it protects cyclists, of course. But I would say maybe even more important is because it shows that a citizen on a $30 bicycle is equally important to one on a $30,000 car. What it does, it raises the social status of the cyclist. The person who is very poor is almost ashamed, or was before, almost ashamed to use a bicycle because it's like a proof that you are a loser in society or something. So with the bikeways, you are constructing equity again. Again, this is why we did it. It was not for the environment, even though now we have very few riders, only about 7%, but still is like 600,000 people a day using bicycles. And I would say, are protected bikeways a cute architectural feature, or are they a right? This is a very interesting question because, for example, I think today we all agree that to have a sidewalk is a right. I am sure in a very advanced society such as Sweden, if somebody gets hit by a car in a place where there is not a sidewalk, I mean, it's almost impossible that there is not a sidewalk here, but maybe if there is some construction project or something and people do not have a sidewalk, and if somebody is hit by a car, I'm sure they will sue government and they will get a lot of money from government because they had a right to have a sidewalk. The question is, do we have a right to bikeways, to protected bikeways, or are they some kind of cute thing that we can do or not do? I think we have a right to have a protected bikeway in every street, the same as we have a right to sidewalks, unless we think only those with a motor vehicle have a right to mobility without the risk of getting killed. But anyway, those are some of the issues I wanted to mention. And of course, I put them in a controversial way so you don't go to sleep. And thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Enrique. Even though you framed it in a position of developing countries, I think very much of what you said is equally relevant to the situation of Sweden. We got a few introductory remarks from mainly focusing on trains, on buses, and on bikes. And then we leave the floor open for discussion. I would like you to speak first, please.
My name is Christer Billman from Trade Operating Companies Association. And thank you very much for your very interesting speech, first of all. But during this speech, I've had a very beautiful Porsche outside the window all the time. And it tells about a few problems when it comes to changing paradigm shifts, which is needed, because that is a status, and we do need status things, and we love that kind of cars. It tells you you're very successful. needs very strong hearts to get through with it, and democracy is a very good way of managing countries, but it's quite a bad way when it comes to paradigm shifts. So it's quite difficulties, and first of all, also I want to say that I have no problems with buses. Buses with run wheels are most welcome, and we do need them, and go for it. Not any problem at all. But at the same time, I was thinking when you were speaking, imagine Stockholm without the underground, without subway. How would that work today from Hässelby to Norsborg, quite many kilometers? Would that be a very good mass transport to use other modes than subway? I'm not that certain, so it kind of gives you possibilities to develop the city and to enlarge the city even further than what the buses are good and do need to use them and use them as much as possible. But there are limits, and you do need rail, and you need it for the longer transports. Today in Stockholm greater region, people are commuting from areas close to Stockholm 200 kilometers every day, and then there is no solution but train. So every mode on its right place. But it's also a question of investments. It's huge investments, and as you say, how to get society to be elected when investing in things or in transport solutions, infrastructure, that will give effect 10 years ahead of now, or 20 years ahead of now, and 4 years to the next election. So the shift in the paradigm, and also how to get the Porsche guy to like public transport, and also how to get long-term investments, and how to get democracy to work towards these very long-term effects. One thing I have noticed, and you didn't mention it, is that the IT solutions are very important to get people to shift mode and leave car, and to find out that there is a train, there is a bus, and there's a timetable, and I can find it very easily on this one. It makes it easy for you to find your way, even if you don't have a Porsche. I like the equality, and how to get this equality to the status for Porsche. I'm not certain. Bogotá is a very large and big city, as the inhabitants of all Sweden, almost the 8 million, it's 9.5 million in Sweden. But still, you have long distances, and you need both cars using together, cooperate. Buses, you need train, and you need to minimize the car use. I'm not certain how to reach there without being despotic.
Can I make a comment on this?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Well, I say trains are wonderful. Who could say they are not? You know, it's all public transport is wonderful. But I will say first that we have to understand the realities. In Bogotá, for example, you have more than 1 million people who do not even have pavement in front of their homes. So that means 300 or 400,000 children who walk in the mud to go to school. So when we are going to do a subway line, it will benefit at the most 5% of the population. For $8 billion, which is now. If we can do another thing that I would be very careful when we talk about buses, I think we have to be extremely careful. A traditional bus route is totally different than a BRT. It's two different animals. They use the same machines, the same buses, but they do things that are totally different. A BRT that is well done is much more like a subway line than like a traditional bus route. Much more. So it's really basically a subway with buses, where you work, where you are using a route, ideally without traffic lights, or you can do underpasses at traffic lights. So actually you have similar speeds than a subway. Actually, for example, in the routes where we have in Bogotá the BRT with no traffic lights, and we have many express buses, they are even faster than many subways. We achieve speeds that are about 40 kilometers per hour operational speed. So this is very similar to a subway. So it's very important to not to talk about buses. BRT and buses are totally different animals, totally different. Another thing, the European cities like Stockholm were made before there were cars, before there were trams, before there was anything. So they are like a maze, you know. Streets are very, like here, you know, small little streets everywhere, you know. So the only way to go fast across the center of Stockholm is underground. There is no other way. Most developing country cities do not have, because when Stockholm was made, there were no cars, no trams, only a few rich people, and very few had horses. Most of people did not even have horses. So most developing country cities are not like that. Most developing country cities tend to have large arteries, even very much through the center of the city. And another characteristic of developing country cities is that they have not really a one center. They have many centralities. Oh, I'm sorry, lucky you had no water. They have many centralities, and they are always shifting. So that's another very high risk of putting an extremely expensive investment in a subway, and then the center goes elsewhere, you know, because most of the people who go to the offices and things go by car. So this is another very high risk of putting subways. But anyway, it's a different kind of structure. I fully agree. There is no other way to go under the center of Stockholm or under the center of London or Paris except underground, which is not necessarily the case in the developing world. And also, I agree fully with you. For longer distances, it's not possible to go in a bus the same as fast as you go on a train. It's much faster. Like this train, beautiful train you have here that goes to the Arlanda airport is beautiful. No bus could do that. We are talking but what I do believe is that, as I say, if we have the money, let's do all the subways we can. But if we don't, how do we use these scarce funds? And so, also, I don't think we should force people underground. For example, I think, again, I don't know if Stockholm has traffic jams or not on their highways, but most developing country cities have traffic jams on their highways. So I ask, I think the most obvious democratic and technical thing to do would be to have exclusive lanes for buses on any large road, in any city. In any city. This is, if besides that you have still money to do an underground subway, wonderful.
Thank you. Let's move on to a comment from Stefan and the Svenska Kollektivtrafik.
Thank you. I'm Stefan Sedin from the Swedish Public Transport Association, and I also want to thank you for an interesting speech, obviously. And I also like to start with saying that even though we like buses, we like trains and subways equally, because our members are providing transport services in every way possible, except by plane, of course. I'm rather new in this sector still, and I'm still having trouble to grasp the Swedish system in all its subtle details. So to comment on development in developing countries is a bit of a stretch, but I'll give it a try anyway. I noticed, as other persons around the table has done, that some problems, even most problems, are the same to maybe less degree, and some problems are the same but to a larger degree. I must say that the possibility to build 90% of the cities of the future from the beginning it's of course a great challenge, but you must also see it as a great opportunity, as you can pretty much start from scratch planning your new cities. As already has been noticed there, I mean, in the so-called developed world, I guess we are pretty much stuck within our existing cities and the boundaries that are already built in there. I don't know if you know this, but public transport sector in Sweden has high goals set for itself. We ought to double the travel by public transport till the year 2020, and we ought to double the market share till the year 2030. I noticed your input there on equity as maybe a hinder for public transport to increase. I would say that we have, you also noticed that, maybe the same problem, but to a lesser degree in Sweden. And we don't talk about equity that much here, but we're talking about the reputation of public transport, which is to say that public transport in some ways are still seen as how should I put it, as not the way to get to work. So that's one problem, the reputation. Other problems to increase the public transport is knowledge about public transport being a possible way to get to where you want to go. Access to public transport in some parts of Sweden, and we also need to be better to inform about the advantage to leave the car and to travel by public transport instead. You need to gain an advantage, better services, fast travel or something like that. It can't be a disadvantage to travel by public transport. Then you probably still take your car instead. And it can't also be just equally good. It has to be an advantage to travel by public transport. I'll stop there.
I will again say that I love trains. I have nothing against trains, you know. But the point is that, look, in Bogotá, this is not theory. Today in Bogotá, we are making these decisions. Today, at this very moment, and we have, clearly, there is a huge pressure to do this subway line. That is 27 kilometers that, again, that will move, if we are very lucky, 5% of the population. By the time we have another $8 billion to invest in some public transport, maybe at least 20, 25 years more, at least. So by that time, I will be well underground. The city is growing very, very much. It's not stopping, waiting for the... So another thing that we should remember is that the cost per passenger of every new subway or train line that you do tends to increase, because normally the first line, if you choose well, you do it where you have the highest demand. The second line, you will have the same cost, but you will have less passengers. So the third line, each time you do a new line, the cost per passenger will increase. So maybe if we do huge investments, maybe in 40 years, in Bogotá, in 40 years, we will have 10% of the population moving by rail. And we still have 90% to solve. So this is not a discussion. But at this time, what would we do? What would we do in Bogotá? Unfortunately, we have to choose. And I'm very much afraid that we will choose the subway line, even though, in my opinion, it's totally irrational investment, because clearly as I mentioned, the BRT, that's basically the same as a subway, or even if it did a little less, we are talking about 27 kilometers instead of 440. with such amount of money, we could do such amazing works. We could do underground passes for buses to avoid all traffic lights and do all kinds of amazing things. So we are talking about. I also, since you mentioned something, we are doing new developing country cities. Imagine, for example, one thing that I did when I was mayor, we did about 70 kilometers of bicycle highways without cars next to them, about 10 to 15 meters wide. So imagine the new cities where, I forgot, if we are going to do a new city, why not have hundreds of kilometers of greenways or roads only for pedestrians crisscrossing the city, that you could go across the city, or maybe also some roads only for buses or trams or whatever. If you want trams basically, again, is cute. Trams are very nice, very cute, but they don't do anything that a bus doesn't except cost more, and they cannot leave but of course, the thing is that when we have this Porsche here, transport is very much related to status. Very much. It's very interesting. For example, even buses, for example, in the United States, they are doing trams everywhere. And they say, why don't they use buses with BRT? Because they say buses are for the Colombians, for the Mexicans, for the African Americans, it's for the poor. And so if we want to get the BMW and the Porsche driving yuppies to use public transport, we have to give them trams, not buses, because buses are not cool, But it's very funny because it was not always like this. In 1940, every city in the world had trams. Every city in the planet had trams. And at that time, it was trams that had the image of being for the poor, and buses only appear, by the way, buses appear very late. Buses appear very late, not like cars in 1905. Buses, because there was not the technology for pneumatic tires to support heavy vehicles. And all roads in 1910 were built like in the Roman Empire, 2,000 years before, like this, with cobblestones. So imagine a bus with hard rubber wheels on cobblestones, So the issue is that status is very important. Status, so we have, when you mentioned that we have to make public transport good, we have to make it sexy, yes, with all these electronic appliances and beautiful buses or trams or whatever. But one more thing is, unfortunately, we all agree on everything. Buses are wonderful, trains are wonderful, but the issue, what can we do? I remind you, this will also affect you, because in the developing countries in the next 50 years, there will be 2.5 billion more people. 2.5 billion. I mean, there is one Stockholm growing in the developing world cities almost every maybe 4 or 5 hours, something like this. Every 10 hours you have a new Stockholm in the developing world this time, or maybe I'm exaggerating, but maybe every 10 days, but something like this. So many of these people in the developing world will have cars. They will create global warming. And this will not affect only them. They will affect Sweden and the whole planet. The whole people living on Earth will be affected by this. So if we have to choose, if you have to advise, for example, at this time, we have the World Bank. The World Bank, some very nice friends of mine in the World Bank, they come out and say, because actually I think the World Bank, really, their business is to lend money. They don't really care much what people do with that money. So they tell the government in Colombia, good, go ahead and do the subway line. All my neighbors, our society is very unequal, this is high income people, all of them will be very happy. They will never use the subway, but they will all be very happy. What to do? Unfortunately, we have to make a decision. Let's assume we have $10 billion in a city like Bogotá for the next 20 years or the next 30 years. Of course, if we can do the BRT and the buses and the subways and the trains, of course, it's wonderful, One of these buses, like you have here in Stockholm, one of these beautiful trains that you have, I think to put one of these, I think the cost of your trains in Stockholm would be maybe more than to give a Porsche to each citizen of Stockholm. I think it costs more. Really, I'm not joking. It's very possible that what these trains that you have today cost today, if you were to make a calculation, costs more than if you were to give a Porsche to each citizen of Stockholm. Not to each household, to each citizen. So, and of course it's wonderful. Who would be against it?
Thank you, Enrique. Let's get a biking perspective as well from logs.
Every time I see an adult on a bicycle, I no longer despair of the future for the human race. That's a famous quote by H.G. Wells after centuries ago. And I would like to say the same thing when I hear you talk. Every time I hear you talk and hear the stories from Bogotá and Colombia, it's hard to not see that the urban development in different areas of the world can create very livable cities and very attractive cities. And it's also fascinating to hear how the bike can play a role in that. Because in comparison to many other infrastructure projects, the bike is very easy because you can just start to use it right away, more or less. And you don't need large-scale infrastructure before you can start this nudging development where more and more people use the bike and more people travel in that way. But one experience that I got when I was in Ghent, in Belgium, I met a mayor there. He also tried to make the bike and public transport and urban places that take away parking spaces. And the first meeting the mayor had with Chamber of Commerce, he used a bulletproof vest because he was so afraid that the shop owners would be upset by taking away this car parking. And I think one good way to increase biking is to build bike lanes, but I think also a very effective and very important thing is to work with parking policy and so on for cars to make the bike more accessible and make the choice between the bike and the car more democratic maybe and more easy. And I think you have had some projects with that as well, with parking policies and so on. So it's a little bit, but I think that's very important to see the communicating vessels between bike and public transport and car, and to see the possibility the bike has to shift the transport balance in a small way or in a very smooth way. And in Sweden, biking increases all the time, but there is still, in comparison to, for example, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark, it's still a lot of work because it's the traffic situation and the traffic planning is very inspired from the 60s, where the bike was something you did during the weekend, and it's still a very intense work to make the bike work together with urban planning and so on. And so it would be nice to hear a bit more about how this shift and how this nudging can be done. But it's very inspiring to hear.
Thank you. Maybe we can have more.
Let's have a few more comments and questions from around the table. Yes, please, go ahead.
My name is Anna Gröden, and I'm from the Federation, Bus and Coach Federation in Sweden. And we have had a large discussion here about the differences in implementing BRT system in the developed countries or in the third world countries. And a lot of people who are taking part in this discussion says that the BRT systems are perfect for the growing world, not for the industrialized or old world, as you said. And we can't copy it into our cities and would have another sort of infrastructure that are more efficient. What are your comments on that? What have you heard when you're traveling around the world and speaking about those issues?
Well, clearly in the developing world, the BRT is a very high capacity machine, especially if you have stations and overpass stations and all of this. All the ingredients are for very, very high capacities. In most of the developed world, wherever you have a corridor with such high demand, you will have a subway. or some kind of, which I do not agree that this is more efficient. It's a different solution. It does the same, but normally is what is politically. So normally, in most of the developers, however, I am seeing, for example, I was just working in a commission in New York. The governor of New York created a commission to think of the future of public transport in New York. And I think the same thing is happening in Europe, but in New York at least, most of the growth in demand over the last 30 years has not been radial, has not been transport demand going to the center, but around demand. And I think this is what is happening in most cities in the world. And so in New York, I was telling you that the Bogotá subway line is very expensive because it costs $275 million per kilometer. In New York, the Second Avenue subway line is costing $1.7 billion per mile. And this is not very different because last week I was in San Francisco, where they are making an extension of the subway line in San Francisco, and it costs $1.1 billion per mile, an extension, which normally costs less because you already have the parking lots for the trains and all this. So 1.1 billion in San Francisco, 1.7 billion. So in New York, what happens? Trains are so wonderful and so marvelous that another thing they do is they increase land values, and they push poor people far away from them. You know, this is another problem. I mean, they are so great, so successful. And so the poor people in New York, for example, tend not to live very close to the subway because it's much more expensive. So anyway, to make the story short, in New York, when we were in this commission, we heard maybe like more than 100 community groups, organized groups, and all this. I would say that 80 or 90 of these groups propose BRT. So the only way to solve these mobility issues in New York, which are not radial but are around this, or for example, last week I was in San Francisco, as I was mentioned. And in San Francisco, they are also doing a BRT in a line that has quite high capacity. I mean, it's not so much as Bogotá, but it's so. And they also think they are BRT. But again, the discussion there, you know what it was? Because the people want to park, so the people do not want to. How many cars can park on a street? You know, it's very little. You know. And however, it was politically impossible in San Francisco to get rid of the parking and to do a really top quality BRT line there.
Enrique?
My name is John Military. I work for an architecture company, design, and also have an event project. You talk about financial mechanics and how BRT is better than rail and so forth. And financial mechanics can be kind of pushed in different directions. Everyone can come with a bigger investment model and push it in different ways. But what I think is most interesting about what you said in respect of generating a movement for change is how you, I think, have some of the best I've heard legal and moral and political mechanics of how you create the movement for change. So when you talk about the principle enshrined in constitutions that everyone has the equal rights, and you position that in relation to road space, that's, I consider, a kind of political mechanic that's very difficult to resist. And I suspect that a lot of municipalities could actually use that if they're creative with how they deploy their legislation or how they deploy their land use planning in a very creative way. And so my question to you would be, now that power gradually, certainly in the States, I'm working with the mayor of Pittsburgh to help implement BRT and other decisions, is coming down from the federal level for these kinds of interventions. Do you think that the political leaders in the US, for example, other cities, are they good at doing that kind of thing, or are they not very good at it? In other words, are they able to use non-financial machinery analysis to kind of get what they want, given that there's always going to be people with more money? And if not, who can help? Can you help them more? Can there be a book of like tricks? I mean, how can you get this done without talking just finance?
Well, no, I don't know if there is a good way to, but I agree what you are saying. You know, when we are talking about these things, they seem minor issues. You know, how to convince to have the political arguments or the marketing arguments, because this is the issue. This is not just about engineering or money. This is about many emotional arguments. But I see that the same, like in San Francisco, I was telling you, they have not had the political clout even to get rid of they have decided to make the BRT line in this, it's called as Gary in San Francisco, the Gary Street corridor. In Chicago again, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, he's convinced they have to do a BRT in a few, and then they are afraid. So these arguments are not so powerful in advanced societies, because sometimes even is the lower income people have cars, you know. But even though, as it was said here in this study, I was very shocked that even in New York, people who use public transport in New York, or people who use cars on average, have like a 40% higher income than those who use public transport. So even there is some inequality in this. But so the equality argument is not so powerful in the United States, because sometimes, or in Europe, because sometimes it's the poor people who drive rather than. But I think anyway, I don't have time here, but I do believe there are some arguments that can be powerful to try to, for example, again, to remind people that road space belongs the same to a child, to a 12-year-old child, or 10 or whatever, than to somebody with a Porsche. You know, they have the same right to road space, and this is not so evident for people. They still, but this is a very. We are in the.
Thank you. We need to wrap this up fairly soon. We were saying that we had to leave at 2. We're doing 3 more quick questions, and then we wrap this up. Anna.
I'm Anna from the Green Party in Sweden, or mainly working with traffic issues, and it's hard to believe, but right now there are great plans of building a great highway, urban highway, just around Stockholm. And right now we have an opportunity to try to stop these plans. We have like 7 months or something. And I just would like you to develop your thinking in communication with citizens, because I think when you talk about paradigm shift, that's really what we need right now. We have an opportunity, but we need to set another mindset. So, what is your recommendation to us when we have like 7 months to stop a highway? How would you talk to people about this?
It's all very difficult because what we are choosing is different ways of life. Sometimes we have to understand, for example, in my opinion, why do people use public transport? Why do people use public transport? Everywhere. When people use public transport, I will be, except for a few eccentrics like us maybe, people use public transport not because they love it, but because they have to. Because there is a very severe obstacle to using cars. I think almost never when people can use the car. So I think it's all like all educational processes, that carrot and the stick. So why do I get there? Because I think at some point maybe we have to think that traffic is not so bad. Why is traffic bad? I mean, the only reason why traffic is bad is because if you're in an ambulance or something, you're going to a hospital, and also for distribution of goods, you know, trucks in a city that you have a lot of traffic. But if it was just for citizens, but if people continue to be able to drive very quickly to their work, it's very difficult that they will move to public transport. So the only possible other, we just have to try to discuss of a different way of life, and that's difficult. It takes a long time. This is why maybe parking policies are so important. You know, in London, they have for 40 years they have not allowed parking in their office buildings, but this is difficult.
Alexander?
Alexander Ståhle, Cotin-Walls, basically. The mayor of Los Angeles said some weeks ago, in 10 years...
The mayor of what?
Of Los Angeles.
Oh.
They say in 10 years, no one will own a car.
10 years.
Yeah, in a city lab conference. And so my question is because he's thinking about car sharing, carpools, but also about self-driving cars. So what are your opinion about them, or what shall we do if we have them, if we get them?
Well, clearly, when very soon cars will be self-driving, I don't know, pretty soon, maybe 30 years, I don't know, but or 40 or whatever, but clearly cars will be much less sexy when they are self-driving, because at this time, one of the attractiveness of cars is that they're almost an extension of you. You know, it makes you feel very powerful, and you press in the accelerator, and then it goes very fast, and you think you are more macho and all this, and you feel. So once the car drives by itself, you're like a passenger. You know, it's like if you're in a taxi or something. So I think it will be much less linked to status and sex appeal and power, and maybe it's. But clearly, this will be good. I think cars are necessary. All kinds of car sharing systems are wonderful, and taxis, and because for many, for example, many times people only need to use the car once every 2 weeks to take their mother to the hospital or to the doctor or something. So sometimes they buy the car just for that, and they end up driving it all the time. So it's very important that people are able to access a car, be it a taxi or a share car or something, because sometimes people want, or they are very fancy, they go into a gala or something, they don't want to be in the public transport. So I think all of these things are very useful, very good for. It's almost necessary that one of the requisites for people not to have cars or not to use the car is that there is some kind of car accessible, very easily accessible, either to rent one, to go to the countryside, or for whatever reason. I think all of this is very good. And this is one of the problems in developing countries, very poor systems of car rental. Very poor, it's very extremely expensive, very difficult to have a car, to rent a car in the developing countries.
Thank you. And last comment from, you were put as Urban, but you're actually Oliver.
Yeah, I'm Oliver from Urbanisma. And as you said, that there is the car is a symbol of status in the developing countries, and we see a shift here in Sweden and many other developed countries where the car is no longer a status symbol. But we do have another problem with a strong car interest and strong economic interests with a strong lobbyism. And it has probably to do with the history of the big car industry, which is no longer here. This you can see this in many ways. For instance, in France, they build, the only way to get governmental co-funding for building trams is if you have a plan to reduce car use at the same time. And here is actually the opposite. You're not allowed to build trams within the streets. You're not allowed to take street space from cars, which has made the tram development very expensive, and it would be the same probably with the BRT solution, as long as you can't really use spaces from cars. So, what is your suggestion to actually to handle this situation with a very strong car voice in Sweden, which would actually influence the policies a lot?
I didn't quite get whether, when they were building trams in France, in order to build trams, the national government gives money for trams only if they give exclusive way to trams. That's what you were saying?
Well, if they have a plan to reduce the car use at the same time. Yeah, it's only
I see. Well, but actually if they do the tram, they will take away the space from cars, no?
Yeah, so in Stockholm we have built some new tram lines lately, and it's been very expensive because we had to build new reserve lanes.
Oh, they have to.
You're not allowed to use the already existing lanes.
Oh, they are not allowed to take space from cars? Well, this is a political discussion. Again, we come back to the first issue, which is how to distribute road space, which is very, very difficult.
For us, it's not mainly, I would say, an issue of status, or that people do want to drive more cars. We see a downshifting trend in the car use, but one thing that is still very strong is the car lobbies and the car economic interests in cars.
Yes, these arguments for cars as an economic, this is why I say we are not against cars. I mean, I'm not against cars. If people can have cars, I think they are wonderful to go to the countryside. As for the economic development, you know, maybe the countries with the highest income per capita in the world today do not have car factories, you know, such as Switzerland or the Netherlands or Denmark. So this is actually a bad argument, but it's still a powerful argument, because even in Colombia, where we only manufacture a few car parts and things, still a lot of people work repairing cars and as mechanics, and not just building them, but keeping them running. But again, I would not go against cars per se. We just want to rationalize a little bit the way cars are used. But the point is, look, here in Sweden, your problem is very different in many ways. But when we are going to restrict car use, it has nothing to do with the manufacturing of cars. It's rather restricting charging for car use in the center, such as doing London, or like you do in Stockholm, to do or maybe charging or restricting parking, you know. But what I do want to finish, I like to remind you, in the developing world, as you mentioned, we have a huge challenge and a huge opportunity. We're building totally new cities. The Prime Minister of India just said 2 months ago that he needs to build 1 million inhabitant cities in the next 10 years. You know, this sounds almost crazy, but this is, maybe he will not build 1 million inhabitant city, but clearly there will be at least 200 million more people in cities. So we could do totally different cities, maybe with some cities designed from the start with roads just for public transport. I think buses or trams or whatever. Cities designed with hundreds of kilometers of roads just for bicycles without cars next to them, or for buses and bicycles. This would be so easy to do at this time. But clearly in the cities that already exist, the political battle is how to use this very scarce road space. This is, I would say, this is one of the greatest challenges in our time. And the most obvious place to start with, as was mentioned by the bicycle leader here, is the car parking. I mean, are we going to continue car parking? Because here I was even taking pictures on my way here, because I saw they have nice big sidewalks, you know, wonderful. But in most countries, you have more space for the cars parked than for the sidewalk. So the first place to start would be if we were just to get rid of car parking and give this space either to bikeways or to sidewalks or to busways. That would be just, and this is, it seems like an easy battle, but it's not.
Here at Fores with the 2030 Secretariat, we try and work in equal measures with bilen, bränslet, beteendet. And certainly within beteendet, within behavior, there's nothing as inspiring as listening to you, Enrique. So I want to thank you all for having participated during these 75 minutes together, and especially you, Enrique, for taking the time to discuss with us. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me. I remind you of one thing. Whatever you do here is a very powerful example to the world. Every measure that you achieve, everything, the car, the charging for car use, bicycle ways, everything, you are an example. So whatever you can do here will have a great impact all over the planet.
Thank you so much.